Leave tonight, old man. You've slept in a house that was never really yours long enough. Nobody in the dining room moved. Behind me, the refrigerator's ice maker cycled and dropped a fresh batch into the bin. 3 hollow clicks in a silence, so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Eleanor's fork stopped halfway to her plate and stayed there, suspended, trembling slightly from the tremor that had followed her home from the hospital. Nobody coughed. Nobody reached for water. My son had just told me I belonged to this house the way a spare key belongs to a drawer. Nobody remembers to check. Useful once, forgotten forever after. My name is Walter Hale. I am 63 years old. I have spent 41 years running Hale Lock and Key out of a narrow storefront on Delancey Street, and in that time I have opened safes that hadn't seen daylight since the Truman administration, picked locks for widows who'd lost their husbands and their spare keys in the same year, and restored the innards of antique mechanisms so old that the men who built them had been dead for a century. I know locks the way some men know scripture, and on that particular Sunday evening, standing at the head of my own dining table in the house my wife's father built in 1931, I understood with total clarity that my son Marcus had just told me, to my face, that I was a guest in my own home. I want to tell you the numbers first, because numbers are the only language I trust completely, the only one that never lies to flatter you or wound you on purpose. 41 years at the shop. 6 of them spent paying down the loan on Ashworth Manor's roof after a hailstorm tore through in 1994, working Saturdays I never billed for. 3,112 nights I have slept under this roof beside Eleanor Ashworth Hale, and not once in any of them did I consider it anything but ours. That is the whole of what I will say about sacrifice, because sacrifice was never the point. What happened next was Ashworth Manor sits at the end of Ashworth Lane, on 4 acres of oak and old stone wall, a house Eleanor's father Charles built with shipping money in 1931 and that Eleanor inherited outright in 1989 when he passed. I married into this house the way you marry into anything larger than yourself. Carefully, humbly, aware every single day for the first several years that I was the boy from Delancey Street, sleeping under a chandelier that cost more than my father's entire pension. I never stopped being aware of it. I simply stopped being afraid of it, which is a different thing entirely. That Sunday had started ordinarily enough. Marcus called Thursday to say he and Renata wanted to bring the kids for a family dinner. Nothing special, just catching up. I should have known something was wrong the moment he used the word family the way a lawyer uses the word alleged. Carefully, as a term with weight he intended to lean on later. But I didn't know it yet. I made a roast. Eleanor, 3 months out from hip surgery and still moving with the careful deliberateness of someone relearning her own body, sat at her end of the table in the chair with the extra cushion I'd added for her, and for 1 hour, one single hour, the evening felt like every other Sunday we'd had in 30 years. Then Marcus set a black leather portfolio on the table between the gravy boat and the bread basket, and everything after that moved at a different speed. He didn't open it right away. That was the first thing that told me this had been rehearsed. A salesman's instinct, letting the object sit there gathering weight before he touched it. Renata sat beside him with her hands folded, her expression arranged into something warm and concerned that didn't quite reach her eyes. Our grandson Nathaniel and his wife Priya were down at the far end with their 2 boys, and I noticed, the way you notice a held breath, that Nate wouldn't look at me. "Dad," Marcus said, and folded his hands the way he does when he's about to explain something he considers obvious to someone he considers slow. "We need to talk about the house." "We're talking about the house right now," I said. "What about it?" That was when he said it. "Leave tonight, old man. You've slept in a house that was never really yours long enough." And then, before I could find words, before Eleanor's trembling fork had even settled back onto her plate, he opened the portfolio and started laying out papers like a man dealing cards he already knew were winners. "This is a transition plan," he said. "Maple Court has a beautiful 2-bedroom suite available on the ground floor. On-site nursing, meals included, a garden courtyard. Mom needs that kind of support right now, and frankly, Dad, so do you, whether you want to admit it or not." He slid a glossy brochure across the table. On the cover, an elderly couple sat on a bench, smiling at nothing in particular, the specific vacant smile of stock photography. We've already put down a deposit to hold the unit. Renata found it. She's been amazing about all this. Renata smiled at me the way you smile at a customer you're about to overcharge. We really have thought about every detail, Walter. You just have to say yes. I looked at my son, this man I had taught to change a tire in the driveway of this house, whom I had walked down the aisle of the church 2 blocks from Delancey Street, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet. The particular quiet of a room right before a storm announces what it intends to do, not calm, still. Marcus, I said, and I kept my voice level with an effort that cost me more than I let show. This house belongs to your mother's family. It belonged to her father, and it belongs to us. Not to a transition plan you drew up without asking either of us a single question. That's exactly the kind of thinking that got you into this position, he said, and something in his voice sharpened, the patience running out the way a man's patience runs out when he's decided in advance that the conversation only has one acceptable ending. You're 63, Dad. Mom just had major surgery. This house is 4 acres and 11 rooms, and neither of you can manage it anymore. Nate's family needs stability. Priya's due with a 3rd in February. This is the responsible thing. This is what a family does. Eleanor set her fork down with a small, deliberate click, and I watched her push herself up in her chair. The effort of it visible in the tightening around her mouth, the careful way she squared her shoulders against pain she'd never admit to. Marcus, she said, and her voice was quiet, but it filled the room the way quiet things sometimes do. This is my father's house. I grew up in that room upstairs with the bay window. I am not leaving it because you decided it would be convenient. Something moved behind Marcus's eyes then, quick as a blink, gone before I could name it. He looked away from her, past her shoulder, toward the window, the way you look past something inconvenient rather than through it. Mom, I know this feels sudden. It is sudden, she said. It is entirely sudden, and you know it. Down at the end of the table, Nate was staring at his plate like he wished the floor would open beneath his chair. Priya had gone very still, one hand resting protectively on the small curve of her stomach, and I noticed, in the particular way you notice things when your whole body has gone alert, that she hadn't touched her wine glass once since the portfolio hit the table. Marcus stood. He has a way of standing that ends conversations, a physical period at the end of a sentence he considers finished. I don't want this to be a fight, he said. I want you to think about it, sleep on it. But Dad, and here his voice dropped, and the warmth in it went thin as ice over a fast current. You've had your run in this house. 50 years from now, nobody's going to remember whose name is on the deed. They're going to remember whether the family stayed together. Make room. That's all I'm asking. Make room for people who still have a future in front of them. He picked up his keys. Renata rose beside him, murmuring something about giving us space to think. Nate glanced back at me once on his way out the door, something apologetic and unreadable in his eyes, or maybe that was only what I needed to see in that moment. And then the door closed, and the house went quiet in the specific, ringing way a house goes quiet, after it has just been told it doesn't belong to the people standing in it. I crossed the room and sat beside Eleanor. Her hand found mine and gripped it harder than I expected from a woman 3 months out from surgery, her fingers cold despite the warmth of the room. Walter, she said softly, the portfolio, he left it. I turned. The black leather folder was still sitting exactly where he'd set it, between the gravy boat and the bread basket, like a bill he'd already decided we'd be paying, whether we agreed to the terms or not. I see it, Maggie, I said. Though her name isn't Maggie, it's Eleanor. But 40 years of marriage gives a man private words for the woman across the table, and that was mine for her in the moments that mattered most. He didn't take it with him. We sat there for a long while after that, not speaking, the roast going cold on the table, the November dark pressing against the windows of a house that had stood for 95 years, and had never, not once in all that time, needed anyone's permission to keep standing. After Eleanor went up to rest, I stayed in the dining room with the portfolio in front of me, and the house gone silent around me the particular way it goes silent at night, settling, the old radiators ticking somewhere down the hall. A house doing what houses do when the people who love them have finally stopped talking and started listening. I have spent 4 decades listening to things most people walk past without noticing: the specific click of a tumbler falling into place, the difference between a pin that's set and a pin that's merely resting. That night, sitting alone at my own table, I listened to my own house and heard, for the first time, something underneath the silence that troubled me. I opened the portfolio. The maple court brochure sat on top, glossy and cheerful, and beneath it a printed floor plan of Unit 114, ground floor, accessible design, the words in a soft blue font meant to reassure. I set it aside and kept going. The second page was a moving company estimate. Reliable Movers of Fairview County, dated 3 weeks prior, itemizing packing materials for an 11-room residence, insurance for fine art and antiques, and a delivery window for the second Saturday of December. 3 weeks. My son had commissioned a moving estimate for our house. 3 full weeks before he'd said a single word to either of us about leaving it. Beneath that was a printed email thread, 6 names in the chain, a subject line that read Transition, Ashworth Manor. The earliest message was from Renata, dated a month back. Okay, team. Let's lock in early December before the holidays get crazy. Marcus, can you handle the movers? I'll take care of Maple Court and start reaching out about the house itself once your parents are settled. And below that, a reply from Marcus. Already on it. Talk to a buyer's agent about the property. She thinks we could move fast on a cash offer once it's vacant. No open listing, no showings, clean and quiet. I read that sentence 3 times. Once to understand it. Once to be certain I understood it correctly. And once more because some part of me, the part that had spent 41 years believing the best about people until their own actions told him otherwise, needed to see it a third time before it would let itself believe. They weren't planning to move Eleanor and me into a smaller, safer place because they were worried about us. They were planning to sell my wife's father's house before either of us had agreed to leave it, quietly, without a listing, to a buyer who wouldn't ask questions about whether the sellers actually wanted to sell. My hands, I noticed with a kind of distant clinical interest, had gone very still. 41 years of testing locks under pressure teaches you what your own hands do when your mind has already made a decision your mouth hasn't caught up to yet. Mine goes still, perfectly, deliberately still, the way you hold a pick steady in a lock you're about to feel give. I closed the portfolio. I set it exactly where Marcus had left it, squared to the edge of the table, and I sat there a while longer in the dark of my own dining room, running my thumb along the worn brass edge of the old skeleton key I still carry in my pocket out of habit. The first key I ever picked clean, decades ago, on a lock my own father installed and then lost the key to, back when I was 17 and furious and certain nobody in that house would ever listen to me either. I didn't know it yet, but that key was about to matter more than it had in 40 years. I went upstairs. Eleanor was awake, sitting up against the pillows with the bedside lamp still on, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, waiting for me the way she'd waited every night for 30 years when something in the house needed saying before either of us could sleep. "Walter," she said, "what did you find?" I sat on the edge of the bed and told her. All of it, the moving estimate dated 3 weeks prior, the email chain, the phrase clean and quiet, that I would not be able to stop hearing for days. I watched her face change as I spoke, watched the particular color drain from it that has nothing to do with lighting and everything to do with a woman. Realizing her son had been planning to sell her father's house out from under her before she'd finished healing from surgery. "He never asked us," she said finally, very quietly. "Not once, not one question. No," I said, "he didn't." She was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed, steadier, colder. The voice I had heard exactly twice before in 38 years of marriage. Both times when someone she loved had been threatened and she had decided, calmly and permanently, what she intended to do about it. "Call Tom Reyes in the morning," she said. "And Walter, there's something I never told you about this house. Something my father asked me to do, years ago, that I've never once mentioned to Marcus." She reached over and took my hand, and her grip was steady now, the tremor gone, replaced by something I recognized because I had spent my whole life around mechanisms built to hold under pressure. I think it's time you knew what's locked in my father's desk. I looked at her, and something in my chest, the same stillness that had settled over me at the dinner table, the stillness of a man who has just heard the first true click of a lock beginning to give, told me that whatever waited behind that locked drawer downstairs was going to answer questions I hadn't even known to ask yet. Tomorrow, she said, before I could ask. Tonight, just hold my hand. Let the house be quiet a little while longer. So I did, and outside the November wind moved through the old oaks that had stood over this house since before either of us was born, and somewhere down the hall my father-in-law's roll-top desk sat exactly where it had sat for 95 years, its bottom left drawer locked with a mechanism I had examined 100 times over the decades out of professional curiosity and never once, not once, thought seriously to open. That was about to change. The morning came in gray and quiet, the kind of November light that makes a big house feel bigger, every room holding its silence a little longer than it should. I brought Eleanor her coffee in bed the way I had every morning since her surgery, and I sat on the edge of the mattress and waited, because I have learned across 38 years that Eleanor tells the truth in her own time, not mine, and rushing her only closes the very locks I am trying to open. My father built this house for my mother, she said finally, both hands wrapped around the mug, but he built that desk for himself, 1933. He had it shipped from a workshop in Vermont, and he used to say the maker built the bottom drawer with a lock that couldn't be forced, only understood. She looked at me then, a small, tired smile at the corner of her mouth. He'd have liked you, Walter. He always did like men who understood things instead of forcing them. What's in the drawer, Eleanor? I don't entirely know, she admitted. My father showed it to me once, the week before he died. He told me there was a letter in there for whoever loved this house enough to protect it properly, and he made me promise I wouldn't open it myself unless I needed to. I never needed to. Not in 36 years. Her hand tightened on mine. I think we need to now. I want to tell you something about locks, because it matters to what happened next, and because it's the one language I have never once had to translate for anyone. A lock does not fail because it is weak. A lock fails because someone, somewhere, stopped respecting what it was built to protect. I had walked past that roll-top desk in Charles Ashworth's study, perhaps 10,000 times in 38 years, and I had never once tried the bottom drawer, because Eleanor had asked me not to, and because some part of me, the part that grew up on Delancey Street watching my own father's temper break locks that should have stayed shut, had learned early that respecting a boundary is not the same thing as being afraid of it. That morning I knelt in front of the desk with my tool roll open beside me for the first time in 38 years, and my hands were not steady. I want to be honest about that, because I have spent my whole life being the calm one, the patient one, the man other people call at 2 in the morning when they've locked themselves out of their own lives. And there is a version of me that people expect to be unshakable. I am not. When I am frightened, genuinely frightened, not the manageable kind, my hands find keys, not to use them, just to hold them, to run my thumb along the teeth, an old and useless habit from a childhood spent listening for the sound of my father's key in our front door and never knowing, until the lock actually turned, whether that night would be a good one. I did it now, sitting on the floor of my father-in-law's study, jingling the ring of shop keys in my left hand while my right hand worked the drawer's ancient mechanism, and I am not ashamed to say it took me longer than it should have, because some part of me did not want to know what was inside. The lock gave with a small, satisfied click, the particular sound of a well-made thing finally allowing itself to be understood. Inside the drawer, a single sealed envelope, yellowed at the corners, and beneath it, a leather folder holding a deed, a trust document dated 11 years back, and a shorter document clipped on top, dated only 14 months ago, that made my chest go tight the moment I read the heading, Amendment to the Ashworth Family Revocable Trust. I did not open the envelope yet. Some things asked to be read in order, and I have spent my whole career learning to respect an order. I called Tom Reyes before I'd finished my second cup of coffee. Tom has handled our affairs since 1998, when he helped Eleanor and me refinance the roof repairs after the hailstorm, And he has the particular gift of good attorneys everywhere, which is that he can hear the shape of a crisis in the first 30 seconds of a phone call, long before the caller has found the words for it themselves. "Walter," he said, "tell me what's happened." So I told him. The dinner, the portfolio, the moving estimate dated 3 weeks prior, the email about a quiet cash sale. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then he said the thing that turned my morning cold all over again. "Walter, I need you to bring me that trust amendment as soon as you can. And I need to tell you something I should have called you about sooner. About 4 months ago, my office received an inquiry from a title company processing a home equity application against Ashworth Manor. Your name was on it. I couldn't verify who had actually submitted it, and the application was withdrawn before it went further, so I let it go. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry, Walter. I should have called you the day it happened. I set my coffee down very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid might slip from your hand. Withdrawn by whom, Tom? That's one of the things I want to find out together. Bring the documents Thursday. And Walter, don't sign anything. Don't let anyone into that house without you present. And for now, don't tell Marcus what you know. I hung up and sat in my father-in-law's study a long while, the sealed envelope still unopened on the desk in front of me, and I thought about a phrase I hadn't been able to shake since the night before. Clean and quiet. A house sold clean and quiet requires the people who love it to be somewhere else. And a home equity application requires a signature, and I had signed nothing. 2 days later, before Tom's office had even finished pulling records, Marcus called to say he wanted to show us Maple Court in person, so you can see how nice it really is before you decide anything. I agreed to go, not because I had softened, but because there are things you learn only by walking through them yourself, and 41 years in a trade built on understanding what other people overlook had taught me that the best way to catch a false promise is to let the person making it lead you straight to the proof. Maple Court sat off Route 9, a beige 3-story building with a cheerful sign and a parking lot that needed resealing. A property manager named Denise showed us Unit 114, our most requested accessible suite, she said, and led us through a living room barely large enough for a love seat and a bookshelf, a galley kitchen with counters too high for a woman recovering from hip surgery to reach comfortably, and finally the bathroom, where I stopped in the doorway and did the thing I have done in 100 houses over 41 years, without ever once expecting to need the skill for my own family. I measured the door with my eye, the way you learn to measure a frame before you've even pulled out a tool. 29 inches, maybe 30. Eleanor's walker, the one Dr. Whitfield had prescribed for the next several months of her recovery, was 26 inches across at the wheels. It would fit through that door with perhaps 2 inches of clearance on either side, and once inside, there would be no room to turn it, no grab bar beside the toilet, no space for me to stand beside her if she needed help. "This is your most accessible unit?" I asked. "Oh, absolutely," Denise said. "Ground floor, no stairs at all, no stairs, and no room to actually live in a body that needed help getting up from a chair." I thought about the 3 weekends I had spent converting our downstairs guest room at Ashworth Manor after Eleanor's surgery, widening the doorway myself, installing grab bars I'd bought with my own hands from the hardware store on 5th, laying non-slip flooring, because I would not trust my wife's safety to a contractor's schedule when I could do the work myself in a weekend. Marcus had watched me do all of that. He had carried lumber for me on one of those Saturdays, and now he was standing in a beige hallway telling me this was the responsible choice for his mother. "How long has this unit been held for us?" I asked Denise. She checked her clipboard. "Let's see. The deposit came in about 5 weeks ago. Mr. Hale here handled it." 5 weeks. The same window near enough as the moving estimate. My son had reserved this apartment before he had said a single word to either of us about leaving our home. I didn't say much on the drive back. Eleanor sat beside me in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and neither of us spoke until we pulled into the long gravel drive of Ashworth Manor, and the old house came into view through the bare November oaks, solid and unhurried, exactly the way it had looked every day of the 38 years I had lived inside it. He measured the bathroom door with his eyes. Same as you did, Eleanor said quietly. I watched him. He knew it wouldn't work, Walter. He took us there anyway. I didn't answer, because I didn't trust what would come out if I opened my mouth just then, and instead I reached over and found her hand, and we sat in the driveway a moment longer before going inside. The way you sit in a parked car sometimes when you need one more minute before the next part of your life begins. That evening, our neighbor Sal Duarte called. Sal had retired from the county sheriff's department 11 years ago and spent his days now tending a garden that consistently embarrassed the rest of Ashworth Lane. And somewhere along the way he'd installed a security camera on his porch that covered a wide stretch of the street, including a clear angle on our own gravel drive. Walter, he said, I don't want to start something that's nothing, but I noticed your son's car in your driveway last Tuesday, middle of the day, while you and Eleanor were both at that doctor's appointment. Wanted to check it was nothing before I mentioned it. My stomach went cold. Tuesday. Eleanor's follow-up with Dr. Whitfield. We had been gone almost 2 hours. Do you still have the footage, Sal? Keep 30 days. Come on over. I drove to Sal's that same night. He poured 2 cups of coffee neither of us drank and pulled up the footage on a laptop at his kitchen table. And I watched, with a stillness that had become almost familiar to me over the past week, as Marcus's car pulled into our drive at 11:14 in the morning. Marcus got out first, then Renata from the passenger side. He walked to the front door and produced a key from his pocket. A key I had not given him, a key that should not have existed, and let them both inside without a moment's hesitation, the unhurried confidence of a man entering a house he already considered his. They were inside for 51 minutes. When they came back out, Renata was holding a small notebook, and Marcus had a tape measure clipped to his belt, retracted now but unmistakably used. Sal zoomed in without my asking, and I watched my son lock the front door of my father-in-law's house behind him with the same casual ease he might have used on his own. Walter, Sal said quietly, watching my face. You want me to keep this footage somewhere safe? Please, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. And Sal, thank you. He shrugged the way men of our generation shrug off gratitude they've decided they don't need. You fixed my garage door lock for nothing back in '99. I remember things too. I went home and did what I have done for other frightened people 100 times over the years without ever once expecting to do it in my own house. I walked every room, slow and methodical, looking for what had been moved. In the front parlor, the portrait of Charles Ashworth that had hung above the fireplace for as long as I'd lived in this house sat very slightly crooked, tilted no more than an inch, the kind of thing you would never notice unless you had looked at that exact wall 10,000 times before. In the study, the antique grandfather clock, Charles Ashworth's clock, the one he'd wound himself every Sunday until the week he died, the one I had taken over winding the day after his funeral and had not missed a Sunday since, stood with its glass case very slightly ajar, the small brass winding key that always hung on a hook inside the case, now sitting loose on the shelf beside it instead. Someone had opened that case. Someone had touched the one mechanism in this entire house that I had personally wound every week for 36 years, a small act of quiet love I had never once explained to anyone because it had never needed explaining. I stood there a long moment with my hand on the cool glass of the clock case and something that had been building in my chest since the dinner table. Not rage, exactly. Something colder and steadier than rage, settled into place like the last pin in a lock finally seating home. I called Tom Reyes, first thing the next morning, and told him everything. The key, the 51 minutes, the tilted portrait, the clock case standing open. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said the words that would set the rest of that week in motion. Walter, bring me the trust amendment and that unopened letter today, not Thursday. And I want you to do something else before you come in. I want you to have the locks changed, all of them, today. I looked down at my own hand, still resting on the glass of Charles Ashworth's clock, and for the first time in 41 years, I found myself grateful, genuinely, deeply grateful, that changing every lock in this house was a job I did not need to hire out to anyone. I can do that myself, Tom, I said. I can do that by 3 o'clock this afternoon. Good, he said, Do it. And Walter, bring Eleanor with you when you come in. What's in that envelope belongs to both of you. I drove to the shop that morning for the first time in 3 days. Past the counter where I'd trained 2 apprentices and turned away more locksmiths in training than I could count, and I filled a box with deadbolts. Good ones. The kind I'd have sold to anyone who walked through my door, and asked for something a determined man couldn't force in under 10 minutes. I didn't know it yet, but by the time I finished installing the last one on the kitchen door that afternoon, Eleanor would be sitting at the dining room table with the sealed envelope in her lap, waiting for me, her hands steady for the first time in a week, ready finally to open the one thing in this house that had been waiting 36 years for exactly this moment. I found her exactly where I expected, at the dining room table, the sealed envelope resting in front of her, one hand pressed flat against it as though she could read what was inside through the paper itself. I set my tool bag down by the door, my hand still smelling of brass filings and cold air, and sat across from her the way I had at every important table of our marriage. I waited for you, she said. My father wrote this for whoever loved this house enough to protect it properly. I think that's supposed to be both of us. I reached across and covered her hand with mine, and together we opened it. The letter was 2 pages, Charles Ashworth's handwritings, steady and old-fashioned, dated the spring before he died. He wrote about the house the way a man writes about something he built with his own reasoning, rather than his own hands. The oak paneling he'd argued the contractor into using instead of pine. The bay window he'd fought his own architect to keep because Eleanor's mother had loved morning light. And near the bottom of the second page, his handwriting grew smaller, more careful, the writing of a man choosing his words with unusual precision. I have watched families lose each other over houses more than I have watched them lose houses over families, he had written. My greatest fear is not that this house will fall into disrepair. It is that someday someone who never lifted a hammer for it will come to believe it was owed to them rather than earned by the people who actually loved it. Eleanor, if you are reading this, I trust you have already chosen wisely who deserves to be that person. Protect this house the way you would protect any living thing, not by keeping it locked away from the world, but by making certain it never falls into hands that see it only as something to be sold. Eleanor's hand had gone very still under mine. I looked up and found her crying, quietly, the specific tears of a woman reading her father's voice for the first time in 36 years, and I did the only thing that felt right in that moment. I came around the table and knelt beside her chair and held her, not saying anything, just holding her the way you hold someone when words would only get in the way of what actually needs to happen. And for a long moment the only sound in the house was the old clock in the study ticking on, faithfully, the way it had ticked every day since I'd taken over its winding. He knew, she said finally into my shoulder. He knew something like this might happen someday. Not Marcus specifically, just someone. He knew enough to warn us. He didn't predict Marcus, I said gently, because it mattered to me that we got this exactly right. He predicted people, Eleanor. That's different. He was worried in a general way, the way any father worries, about love turning into ownership. That's not a crystal ball. That's just a man who understood families. She nodded against my shoulder, and after a while she straightened and wiped her eyes and reached for the leather folder, the trust amendment underneath the letter, and I watched her go still all over again as she read it. 14 months ago, she said slowly. Walter, I did this 14 months ago. After that dinner, where Marcus started talking about his real estate portfolio and how much equity he thought he was sitting on. Something about the way he said it, like he was already counting this house as part of it, bothered me enough that I called Tom quietly, without telling you, and asked him to change the trust. I sat back on my heels and looked at my wife, this woman who had kept a secret from me for 14 months, not out of deception, but out of the particular, fierce love of someone protecting something before she'd even fully understood what she was protecting it from. You never said a word, I said. Not an accusation, just an acknowledgement. I didn't want you carrying the worry until I knew it mattered, she said. I'm sorry, Walter. I should have told you the day I did it. You did exactly right. I told her, and I meant every word of it. You saw something before either of us could name it, and you protected this house. That's not a secret you owe me an apology for. The amendment was 2 pages, plain language, and it said, in essence, what her father's letter had already told us to expect. Sole ownership of Ashworth Manor rested with Walter James Hale as trustee, full authority over the property during both our lifetimes, and upon the death of both trustees. The estate would pass into a scholarship trust in Charles Ashworth's name, administered independently, funded for the education of the great-grandchildren, with no ownership interest whatsoever reserved for Marcus. He had built his entire plan, the movers, the quiet cash sale, the deposit on Maple Court, on the assumption that this house would eventually be his to sell, an assumption 14 months out of date, and one he had never once thought to verify. Thursday morning, Tom Reyes's office smelled the way it always had. Old paper and the specific bitterness of coffee, brewed too strong on purpose. He shook my hand the way he'd shaken it every visit for 26 years, pulled out Eleanor's chair for her before she could manage her walker into position herself, and got straight to it in the way I had always respected about him. I want to start with something I promised to explain, he said, and slid a folder across the desk. Not the trust folder, a different one, thinner, but heavier somehow in the way that only bad news manages to be heavy on paper. The home equity inquiry I mentioned. It came from First Fairview Bank in August. The application listed you as sole applicant, Walter, requesting $190,000 secured against Ashworth Manor. The bank's underwriting team flagged the signature as inconsistent with your file from the 1998 refinance. They contacted my office because I'm listed as attorney of record on the property. The application was withdrawn before it reached final review. Someone canceled it themselves rather than let it go to a signature verification hearing. I looked down at a photocopy of the signature line. My name, written by someone else. Close but not quite right. The H a little too rounded, the loop of the W not the way I've made it since I was a boy. I never signed this, I said. I know, Tom said, and I want to be careful here, because I don't have proof of who submitted it. What I can tell you is that the application listed a contact email belonging to a business account, an event planning and home staging business registered to Renata Hale. The room went very quiet. Eleanor's hand found mine under the table. I'm not going to tell you what to do with that information today, Tom continued. I'm telling you so you understand the full shape of what you're dealing with. Submitting a signature that isn't your own on a loan application is bank fraud under federal law. That's a serious matter, and it's one I'd strongly encourage you to let me handle carefully, rather than confronting anyone with it directly. At least not yet. He turned to a third folder, thinner still, and this one he opened with a kind of weary precision, the look of an attorney who has spent the better part of a week reading things that made him angry on someone else's behalf. Walter, I did some additional digging into Marcus's financial situation, because a man doesn't quietly plan a cash sale of his parents' house without a reason. What I found comes from public court filings, so I want to be clear, this isn't anything I obtained improperly. He turned the page toward me. There's a civil judgment for $81,000, originating from a short-term rental investment property in Fairview that went underwater last year. There's a second debt, $44,000, across 2 business lines of credit tied to Renata's staging company, both currently in default with formal demand letters sent. And there's a third figure I want you to see specifically, a private loan of $60,000, borrowed 18 months ago from a family friend named Preston Cole, with a repayment deadline of December 15th. That's 5 weeks from today, $185,000. And a deadline 5 weeks away that lined up almost to the day with the moving estimate Marcus had commissioned for our house. Who is Preston Cole? I asked, though something in my chest had already begun to suspect the shape of the answer. A real estate investor, Tom said. He runs a company called Swift Sale Properties, cash offers, fast closings, no open listings. I believe he's the buyer's agent Marcus mentioned in that email thread you found, the one who could move quickly on Ashworth Manor once it was, in his words, clean and quiet. I thought of Preston Cole's name printed in that email chain, and something clicked into place with the particular finality of a tumbler finding its seat. My son didn't merely want us out of the house so his family would have room. My son owed the very man he intended to sell it to. There's one more thing, Tom said more gently now, and I want you to hear this the way I mean it. Not as an accusation against your wife's family or yours. I don't believe Marcus built this plan alone, and I don't believe he built it first. The staging business, the withdrawn loan application, the contact with Preston Cole, every thread I've traced runs back to Renata's accounts before it runs back to his. I think your son is in over his head in a way he doesn't fully understand himself, and I think someone very close to him has been steering that debt toward one particular solution for a long time. I sat with that for a moment. Eleanor's hand tightened in mine. What do we do? She asked. Tom closed the folders and folded his hands on top of them, the posture of a man who has finished delivering the hard part and is ready to move toward the part that helps. First, we don't confront anyone with the loan application or the financial figures directly, not yet, and definitely not publicly. That information needs to stay between the four of us and, when the time comes, a judge, if it comes to that. Second, Walter, I want a letter from Dr. Whitfield confirming both your competency in plain clinical language, purely as a protective measure, in case anyone tries to argue otherwise later. Third, I think it's time we talk about how and when you tell Marcus what you know, because he is going to find out eventually that this house was never his to sell, and I'd rather that happen on our terms than his. There's a rededication ceremony at the Historical Society next month, Eleanor said quietly, for the Manor's 95th anniversary. Marcus doesn't know I've been planning it with the Society for over a year. The whole family's invited. Half of Ashworth Lane, too. Tom looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression sharpened into the particular focus of a man who has just seen the shape of a plan complete itself. Eleanor, if you're thinking what I believe you're thinking, I want it done exactly right. Nothing said publicly that hasn't already been verified and confirmed appropriate to share. Anything sensitive, anything about the loan or the debts, gets handled privately before that day, not shouted across a room full of your neighbors. I understand, she said, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard in years. Not since the early days of our marriage, when she'd stood up to her father's business partner over a contract dispute that everyone else in the family had been too polite to challenge. But I would like my father's house to finally tell my son the truth about who it belongs to, in front of the people who actually built this town alongside him. I drove Eleanor to Dr. Whitfield's office that same afternoon, and he wrote the letter without asking a single unnecessary question. The particular quiet competence of a man who has practiced medicine in this town for around 20 years, and understands exactly what his patients are really asking for, even when they don't say it directly. That evening, I called a home care agency and arranged for a part-time aide named Carol to begin the following week. Mornings only. Someone whose sole job would be looking after Eleanor, regardless of whatever else happened in the weeks ahead. And that night, lying in bed with the house finally locked the way I trusted it to be locked, I began, in pencil on a legal pad, the same way I plan the restoration of any complicated old mechanism, one careful step at a time, in the order the lock actually requires, not the order I might wish it did. I didn't know it yet. But by the time Marcus arrived at Ashworth Manor, with the rest of the family 2 weeks later, for what he still believed was a rededication ceremony, every one of those steps would already be in motion, and the house that had stood on Ashworth Lane for 95 years was about to remind him, in front of everyone who had ever loved it, honestly, exactly whose name had been protecting it all along. The morning of the rededication arrived cold and clear, the kind of December sky Ashworth Lane specializes in, pale blue and scoured clean by an overnight wind that had stripped the last of the oak leaves from the drive. Eleanor wore the deep green wool dress she'd worn to her father's funeral 36 years earlier, the one she kept for occasions that mattered enough to deserve it, and I put on the gray suit I'd bought for our 40th anniversary and hadn't worn since. Carol had Eleanor's walker positioned by the front hall, though Eleanor had decided, quietly and without discussion, that she intended to walk the receiving line without it, leaning instead on my arm the way she'd leaned on it since 1987. Tom Reyes arrived at 8, an hour before the guests, with a notary named Rachel Boone and a leather portfolio of his own, considerably thinner than Marcus's had been, containing only what the law actually required and nothing more. Sal Duarte came at 8:30 in his good jacket, carrying a flash drive he handed to Tom without a word, the two of them exchanging the kind of nod that men who understand quiet obligations exchange instead of speeches. Dr. Whitfield's letter sat in the portfolio too, two clinical paragraphs stating plainly what should never have needed, stating it all. By 9, cars had begun filling the gravel drive and the overflow lot the Historical Society had arranged in the meadow beyond the old stone wall. I stood at the front door greeting people I had known for decades, clients whose locks I'd fixed, whose safes I'd cracked open after a lifetime, whose grandfathers I'd apprenticed under on Delancey Street, and I understood, watching that steady stream of familiar faces arrive, that Eleanor's 95th anniversary rededication had quietly become something else entirely, something neither of us had planned, but both of us, I think, had known might happen the moment Tom suggested it. Marcus arrived at 9:15 with Renata, Nate, and Priya, and the boys trailing behind, and Sophie, their daughter, 24, home from law school for the holidays, walking a little apart from her parents the way she'd walked apart from them, I realized watching her now, for most of the last year. "Dad," Marcus said, shaking my hand with the easy confidence of a man who believed the hard conversation from 2 weeks ago had already been won by patience and silence. "This is a nice turnout. Grandpa Charles would be proud." "He would," I said. "Come inside. There's something I want to show the family before the ceremony starts." I led them into the study, just the 5 of them and Eleanor and myself, and closed the door against the noise of the gathering crowd outside. Marcus's eyes went first to the grandfather clock, its case closed now, its brass key back on its rightful hook, and something flickered across his face that told me he remembered exactly what he'd done to that clock, whether or not he'd admitted it to himself since. "I want to talk to you and Renata privately before this ceremony happens," I said, keeping my voice level, keeping it the way I'd have kept it explaining a mechanism to a nervous apprentice. "Not to embarrass anyone, just so nothing said today comes as a surprise to the two of you specifically." Renata's smile, the warm arranged one she'd worn at that first dinner, held for exactly as long as it took her to see Tom Reyes step into the doorway behind us. "Marcus," Tom said quietly, "in August, an application for $190,000 against this house was submitted to First Fairview Bank under your father's name. The bank's own review found the signature didn't match his file. The application listed a contact email registered to Renata's business account. He let that sit a moment, not as an accusation shouted, but as a fact laid gently and irreversibly on the table between them. I'm not here to discuss criminal exposure today. I'm here so that whatever your father chooses to say to your family this afternoon doesn't blindside either of you." Marcus turned to Renata. I watched something pass between them. Quick and wordless, the particular look of a man realizing all at once that a plan he'd believed was theirs together had actually belonged, from the beginning, most to her. "You told me the bank denied it because of a paperwork error," Marcus said slowly. "You told me it was nothing. It was going to work," Renata said, and her voice had lost every trace of the warmth she'd carried into this house 2 weeks earlier. "We needed it to work, Marcus. Preston's not going to wait forever, and you know exactly what happens if we don't have that money by the 15th. You forged my father's name. I protected our family," she snapped, "because you were too busy being everyone's favorite son to actually solve the problem you created." Sophie, standing near the door, made a small sound, not quite a gasp, more like the sound of something she'd suspected for months finally being confirmed out loud. Marcus looked at his daughter, and whatever remained of the composure he'd walked into this room with drained visibly out of his face. "Dad," he said, and his voice had gone rough, stripped of the salesman's ease I'd watched him wear for 2 weeks. "I didn't know about the signature, I swear to you, I didn't know. I believed him, and I want to be honest about that, because it would have been easier in some ways not to. I believe you didn't know the specifics, I said. But you knew about the moving estimate, Marcus. You knew about Maple Court, about the apartment with the bathroom door too narrow for your mother's walker. You knew about Preston Cole and the quiet sale before it was ever clean or quiet. Those weren't Renata's decisions alone. He didn't answer that. He didn't have an answer, and I watched him understand, in real time, that he didn't. There's a ceremony starting in 20 minutes, I said. I'm not going to humiliate you in front of 200 people, Marcus. That was never the plan. And it isn't the kind of man I raised you to become, whatever else has happened. But I am going to tell this family, publicly and plainly, who this house belongs to, because your grandfather asked me to protect it, and I intend to keep that promise. We walked out to the ceremony separately, the family arranged in a loose, wounded cluster that no one watching from the lawn would have mistaken for the warm reunion the invitation had promised. The Historical Society had set up a small dais on the front lawn, garlands of winter greenery strung along the porch railing, and perhaps 150 people gathered across the frost-touched grass. Neighbors, old clients, the mayor's office, a reporter from the county paper covering the manor's restoration for a feature piece. Sal stood near the back with his wife. Carol stood close to Eleanor's side, professionally unobtrusive, ready. Tom spoke first, brief and formal, the plain history of Ashworth Manor and its restoration, the kind of remarks any historical dedication requires. Then he turned to me, and I stepped up onto the dais with Eleanor's hand in mine, and I said the only thing I had actually planned to say all along. 95 years ago, Charles Ashworth built this house believing that a home is only as strong as the people who choose every single day to actually take care of it, I said. I married into this family 38 years ago as a locksmith's apprentice with more calluses than money, and this house taught me something about myself I don't think I'd have learned anywhere else. That you don't protect what you love by locking it away from the world. You protect it by making sure it never falls into hands that only see it as something to sell. I felt Marcus go very still beside Renata, several feet back from the dais, and I did not look at him, because this was not, in the end, about him. 14 months ago, my wife amended her father's trust to place sole ownership of this house in my name, not because she doubted anyone in this family, but because she loved this house enough to protect it the way her father asked her to, all those years ago, in a letter I only read 2 weeks ago myself. I felt my voice catch, and I let it, because pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. That letter said something I've been thinking about every day since. He wrote that his greatest fear wasn't that this house would fall into disrepair. It was that someday, someone who never lifted a hammer for it would come to believe it was owed to them, rather than earned. A murmur moved through the crowd, the particular ripple of an audience beginning to understand they were witnessing something more than a historical dedication. I've made mistakes in this family, I said, and this was the part I hadn't fully planned, the part that came up out of me the way true things sometimes do, uninvited and necessary. I gave my son everything I never had growing up, and somewhere along the way I forgot to teach him the difference between being given something and earning it. That's on me as much as anyone. I stayed quiet too many times when I should have said something, because it was easier to keep the peace than to have the hard conversation. I won't do that again. Sophie stepped forward then, out of the family cluster, her voice carrying clear and steady across the frozen grass in a way that made the whole gathering turn toward her. I want to say something, she said, and I watched Renata reach for her daughter's arm, and Sophie stepped just out of reach, gently, without looking away from the crowd. My grandfather has spent 2 weeks trying to figure out how to protect this house without destroying his own family, and I've watched him do it with more patience than my parents deserved. I love my mom and dad, but I'm not going to stand here and pretend I don't know what almost happened to my grandparents, because I do, and it isn't fair to let everyone believe today is only about a house. The crowd had gone very quiet. The particular silence of people who understand they are watching a family tell the truth in public, because it has become the only place left where the truth could safely be told. Down near the front, one of Nate's boys, 5 years old, bundled in a puffy blue coat too big for him, entirely unaware of the weight in the air, tugged on his father's sleeve and asked, in the clear, carrying voice small children use without any sense of when a question might land too hard. "Daddy, if it's great-grandpa Charles's house, how come Uncle Marcus wanted it to be his?" Nate opened his mouth and closed it again, and it was Priya who crouched down and answered her son gently. Her voice soft but clear enough that half the front row heard it too. "Sometimes grown-ups forget that loving something and owning something aren't the same thing, sweetheart. Grandpa Walter's been trying to help everyone remember. I don't think I have ever, in 63 years, heard anything land quite as hard as that small, honest sentence from a 5-year-old's mother, spoken to a 5-year-old, in front of 200 adults who badly needed to hear it too." Marcus stood very still at the edge of the crowd, Renata a few feet away from him now, the physical distance between them widening the way distance widens between people who have just discovered they were never quite standing on the same ground. When he finally moved, it wasn't toward me, it was toward his daughter. "Sophie," he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable of her name in a way I hadn't heard since she was small enough to carry on his shoulders. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry you had to be the one to say that." "I'm not," she said. "Someone had to." The Historical Society's president, visibly unsure what to do with a dedication ceremony that had become something else entirely, gently suggested a break for refreshments, and the crowd dispersed in the particular careful way. Crowds disperse from something they know they shouldn't have witnessed, but are grateful, in some private corner of themselves, that they did. Eleanor found me by the porch railing afterward, and I put my arm around her, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all, just stood together looking out at a lawn full of people who had come to celebrate a house and left having witnessed a family tell each other the truth instead. "Was that too much?" I asked her. "The letter out here in front of everyone?" "It was exactly enough," she said. "My father would have loved every uncomfortable second of it." Marcus found us an hour later, after most of the guests had gone, Sal and Carol and Tom having quietly excused themselves to give the family what privacy remained. He stood on the porch steps below us, the confidence I'd known my whole adult life as his defining feature entirely gone, replaced by something rawer, and I thought, considerably more honest than anything he'd shown us in 2 weeks. "I owe you both an apology I don't know how to make big enough," he said. "I let myself believe this house was going to solve a problem I created myself, and I let Renata talk me into believing that made it okay to stop asking either of you what you actually wanted." He looked down at his hands. "I'm going to lose the house on Maple Street. Preston's calling the loan regardless of what happens here. I have to face that. I know I have to face that." "You do," I said gently, but without softening it, "because some things a father owes his son honestly, even now, especially now, and I'm not going to pretend that isn't going to be hard, or that I can make it easier by handing you something that was never mine to give away in the first place." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to." Eleanor stepped down one stair, closer to him, and put her hand against his cheek the way she'd done when he was small enough to need it constantly, and old enough now to have nearly forgotten what it felt like. "You are still my son," she said. "That never once stopped being true, Marcus. Not for one single day of the last 2 weeks, however angry I've been. But you are going to have to learn to build something of your own, the way your father did, one honest year at a time, and I am not going to apologize for refusing to hand you a shortcut." He nodded, and something in his shoulders finally released, the particular loosening of a man who has been braced for judgment and received, instead, something closer to an open door. 3 weeks later, on a bright cold Saturday in January, we held a smaller gathering at Ashworth Manor, just family this time, no dace, no historical society, no reporters. Nate and Priya's new baby, born 2 weeks early and healthy, slept in a bassinet by the fire, while the older boys chased each other around the dining room table. Eleanor's father had bought in 1934. Sophie sat beside her grandmother on the sofa, the two of them deep in a conversation about law school that had nothing at all to do with the events of December. Marcus arrived alone. Renata had moved out of their house the week after the ceremony, and the specifics of what would happen between them remained, for now, unresolved and none of my business to narrate. and he spent most of the afternoon in the study, quiet, running his hand along the glass case of Charles Ashworth's clock, the way I had done 10,000 times over 38 years. "I never knew you wound this every Sunday," he said, when I came in to check on him. "Since the week your grandfather died," I said. It seemed like the kind of promise a house deserves someone keeping. He was quiet a moment. "I'd like to learn how, sometime. If that's still something you'd want to teach me." I looked at my son, 63 years old myself, and finally understanding, watching him stand there in his grandfather's study with his hand resting against a clock he'd once left ajar out of carelessness, that the lesson I'd spent 41 years learning about locks applied just as completely to families. You don't force a mechanism that stopped trusting you. You wait, and you listen for the click, and you let the person on the other side decide in their own time whether they're ready to be understood rather than opened by force. "I'd like that," I said. "Sunday mornings. Same as always." That evening, after everyone had gone home, and the house had settled into the particular hush it kept, only after a full day of family had passed through it, Eleanor and I sat in the study with 2 cups of tea, the clock ticking steadily on the shelf between us, freshly wound. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. "The trust amendment. Keeping it from him all those years." I thought about that honestly before I answered, because she deserved an honest answer and not a comforting one. "I regret that I didn't teach him, a long time ago, that this house was never something owed to anyone. I think if I had, none of the rest of it might have happened at all." I reached over and took her hand. "But I don't regret protecting it, Eleanor. Not for one single second." She smiled, the tired, satisfied smile of a woman who has spent 38 years married to a man who understands. At the deepest level, a person can understand anything, the difference between a lock that keeps people out and a lock that simply asks to be respected. If you've stayed with me through Ashworth Manor's whole story, I want you to know something I've come to believe more firmly than almost anything else in 63 years of turning keys for other people's lives. Love is not a lock you can force. It waits patiently to be understood by the people willing to actually learn the mechanism, and it protects itself every single time from the people who only ever wanted to walk through it uninvited. My personal belief, for whatever it's worth from an old man who spent his life on his knees in front of other people's front doors, a house given freely is worth nothing beside a house genuinely earned, one honest Sunday at a time. If something in this story stayed with you the way it stayed with our family, tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if there's someone in your life who's ever mistaken being loved for being owed something, share this with them gently. I'll see you in the next story.